Hello, this is Samantha and Zessie.
And it's your boy, Ramoy George Philip the First.
And this is Masculinity. Yeah, so I'm actually really excited because I'm in the presence of greatness.
Oh, speaking of greatness, have you on Netflix right now? I don't know if they're paying.
Incredible deflection.
I don't know if they're paying for this plug right now.
I'm not doing that.
Like
Ramoy wants me to stop you.
Netflix has Queer Eye for the Straight Guy in Japan right now, which is dope. I mean, there's some ones that'll make you cry, even though there is like a language barrier, lost in translation. Shout out to that. But then I just was at this festival and saw this dope little short called Little Miss Sumo.
You mean your festival that your movie was also playing at?
The Little Miss Sumo, that's about a Japanese woman that's trying to break the barriers within the sport of sumo in Japan. It's a short. It's really good. It's on Netflix. Go peep that. Go peep Queer Eye and cry your eyes out. And that's all I got to say about that.
Cool. So despite Ramoy's best deflection efforts, Ramoy's documentary Hurdle was picked as, was it the top 10 at all of Doc NYC's?
Yeah, there's
film
some
festival.
writer who wrote that.
They had hella movies, and Hurdle ended up in the top 10. So you guys, if you haven't seen Hurdle, it's time to giddy up and go see it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a part of a university or educational system, or if you're a part of a library that uses Canopy, you could probably stream it very soon, or just reach out to us so we can figure something out.
That's right. That's right.
If you're just joining us in this workplace module, we've been exploring this thing we call masculinity contest culture that seems to be thriving in many, if not all, workspaces. And it doesn't discriminate. Whether it's in like the corporate world or in creative industries or even on the basketball court, it's a work culture that has been defined by an attitude of showing no weakness, being extra strong, having extreme physical stamina, putting work above everything and anyone else, and of course, ruthless competition.
I mean, by and large, this attitude is pervasive and shows up everywhere, even in our everyday lives.
Yeah, but can we get some examples, please?
Well, I'm glad you asked, actually, because there's actually a dynamic that's quite common and has shown up when men request time off, for example, at work.
I don't need time off.
There you go. While it's actually already not super accepted for people to want and request breaks. I don't need time off. I can
keep working through it.
Anyway, as Ramoy may or may not be displaying right now, in these types of environments, one thing that's been reported on is how much men get harassed actually for taking time off when they're actually looking to care for someone they care about. So what that means is if they take time off to go on a golfing trip with their homies, that's much better received than if they take paternity leave, for example, or if they want to take care of like their sick aunt or cousin. That's true. Yeah, and it actually doesn't stop there. There's a whole study of men being fired for taking paternity leave and people going to court over it. And some people have actually been told flat out at their job.
Maybe a dude wants to take a self-care day and take care of himself.
That's what I'm saying. I feel like dudes can do that. Do you take self-care days?
Hell no.
See, there you go.
Contest work culture.
And so even companies that offer paternity leave have told their employees flat out when they were starting that, we offer paternity leave, but don't even think about taking it. So it's kind of wild out here.
Yeah, I mean, all my jokes aside, it's really true. Like, that's even emblematic of what we're talking about here. And it's like legit wild to actually see how this contest culture, like this literal thing that we're doing every day, is embedded so deep every day in our day-to-day. Like, it's emblematic. It speaks to, it points to the fact that while it's important to put like actual policies in place to ensure that people, no matter your gender, are supported systematically, those policies and laws can be trumped by like kind of this unspoken yet deeply rooted culture that we practice every day.
And so one of the quotes actually that stands out from this seminal article by the Harvard Business Review, which really has just impacted the way that I'm looking at this whole workplace, and hopefully yours as well, is the following. Quote, research has shown that people in masculinity contest cultures think their coworkers embrace these norms when in fact they do not, breeding pervasive but silent dissatisfaction alongside active complicity as people stay quiet to prove they belong. Isn't that crazy? We continue to subscribe to this thing that doesn't work for us because we think everybody is subscribing to it, but we're all subscribing to it even though we all don't like it. And it's only because we don't talk about it. Does that make sense? I mean, this is really what we want to get into today, right? We've become used to the way that we do work and haven't necessarily been using such descriptive and identifying language, mostly just accepting the fact that that's just the way it is. And so today we have got Jason Rosario in the studio.
Yep. To that. You guys got the claps and the sound effects?
I mean, they come straight from my mouth, so yeah.
Homemade sound effects. So we're going to be delving into what it looks like to make changes within organizations, and specifically to just look at how our notions of masculinity impact our work lives. So Jason is the founder and creative director of The Lives of Men, a social impact creative strategy and diversity accelerator. Love the term diversity accelerator, by the way. Awesome. So they create content and strategic initiatives that help redefine and
we
shape.
should be best friends.
I know.
That's all I've been wanting to do. For
Jason's amazing. And shape modern masculinity while advocating for greater gender, racial, economic, and social equity. Jason, major welcome to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I really appreciate it. And I know we connected sometime over the summer or maybe even in the spring, and then reconnected in the summer. So thank you for being so diligent. And I'm always humbled when people ask me to share my story. So thank you for having me.
Well, Jason, I don't know you, so can you describe a little bit more to me and our audience and our listeners, more detail, like what the work you do through Lives of Men and how did it all start?
Yeah. So what I do in a nutshell is that I do men's work. And I do men's work to help redefine masculinity, which is whatever that means, right? But redefine it, challenge what we view as identity in that process, and then also doing that by also examining integrity. Not integrity in the sense of what we tend to think about it as in terms of being truthful, but it's more about integrating the parts of ourselves as men that we've been lost, that have been disconnected through socialization and traumas. But the genesis of it was, as a product of a single parent home, oldest of 5 kids in the Bronx. I had to learn how to be a man by trial and error in large part, making a lot of mistakes, getting into a lot of trouble. And, selfishly, I wanted to create a platform that for me was the medicine that I needed growing up, first and foremost, and then turn around and package that in a way that other people can draw inspiration from. So that was the kind of the more personal genesis behind it. And then in a very real sense, 2016 happened with all of the police murders that were going on, specifically July 5th and 6th, Terrence Crutcher one day, Philando Castile the next. It was just like, man, the time had come, at least in my mind, and given everything that was happening with me in my personal life and at work, where I was just like, maybe my time is now to kind of do something that hopefully leaves the world in a little bit better place than I found it. And so I launched The Lives of Men, and this was pre-Me Too going viral, pre-Trump. All of a sudden, I find myself in the middle of a public discourse around these conversations, and I'm like, all right, here we go. So,
so what? Maybe this is a broad question, but like, what is the story out there that we need to be pushing? What is the story that you're seeing out there that's kind of pushing things forward? Or what do you hope to see, or what do you expect to see in the very near future?
Yeah, so I just had this conversation last night about where we are, and I think generally speaking, so we are now, give it maybe 2.5 years post Me Too going viral. We're still very much, I don't think we're in any sort of post Me Too world. We're in it. But I do think that the conversation requires somewhat of a shift. And what I think is missing is a conversation around perhaps restorative justice, right? Perhaps education. And I know that conversation, there are 2 schools of thought here. There's a school of thought that says, no, it's still too early. You're a man. You can't talk about restorative justice. You just got to shut up and take the brunt of it, right? Take the L. And I get that. I'm speaking from a position of privilege as a man, and oftentimes that rebuttal comes from victims. And so I get that, right? But on the other side of that, I'm like, okay, so if you're only indicting men, and if you're only pointing the finger at behaviors, then where is the room for us to teach men differently? And I think that's where I'd like to see the conversation going. Not to say that women have to teach men, but I think there has to be a dialogue where we come together, because what's happening is, and I don't, I think it's completely the wrong approach, but men are retreating. Men are saying, I don't want to have closed door meetings with women. I don't want to mentor them. I don't want to hire women. That's not the right approach. And so I think that's the negative byproduct of the way Me Too has unfolded over the last 2 years, that for me, is a signal for something needing to be changed.
There's an opportunity.
There's an opportunity here.
Yeah.
So if you ask me what I'd like to see going forward is for us to have a conversation, perhaps not about restorative justice and forgiveness, okay, but perhaps is what does it look like for us to, women have done their work, and when I say women, I also mean LGBTQ folks, et cetera. The groups have done their work, both men and women, and we come together and explore what that work looks like together going forward. You know what I mean? Not ascribing responsibility to any one group for the other's work, but how do we come together as a community and start building stronger communities?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit like wanting to hear more about this restorative justice that you speak of, specifically because I think that when it comes to the workplace, there's room for that. But I want to hear about what you see that looking like, if that were to be it.
Yeah, that's great. I don't have the answer to that. I think it's just really about, because again, I'm speaking from a position of privilege as a man, right? I'm not a victim. So I will never understand how hard it is to forgive someone that's violated you in that way, right? As
restorative justice for the, okay. Yeah.
Right, restorative justice for both parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like for the woman to say to the man who's sexually abused her is, I forgive you. I don't condone what you did, but I forgive you. I let you go from that. You got to understand what we mean by forgiveness, right? Like defining what forgiveness is first and foremost is important. But yeah, that's what I mean. And then for the man is allowing that man to say, you know what, I made a mistake. Here's what I've done, right? Because there's got to be a set of actions and
accountability.
Yeah, exactly. Here's what I've done and to correct that action. And I apologize. That's who I was then, but here's what I'm doing to correct it. That conversation, I think there's room for that conversation today.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that no one is absolving anyone for mistakes that they've made, but we're all human beings. And I think, again, I am surrounded by women. I have a daughter as well. So I can't fathom one of my sisters or my daughter, God forbid, coming to me and saying, Dad, I was raped. Like, I don't know what I'd do, right? So I am speaking again from a position of privilege, but I do think that there's a place for humanity and for that conversation to take place.
So when we're talking about like a creative agency and accelerator, like are you putting together like Gillette ads, or like what is like the work that you're trying to do?
Yeah, so we're trying to unlock the best of a brand from the inside out. And so it's not just affecting product design strategy from a project perspective, right, or an output perspective. It's about how we use these same conversations and insights to create and help develop a culture of inclusion. So in the ways that we just talked about. So when I say that, I say, okay, so say I'm pitching a client and you brought up Gillette. So the perfect example of the type of work that we want to do is, and I had the pleasure of talking to the folks that created the Gillette ad from a couple months ago.
Wishful post in case anybody hasn't seen it.
Yeah, no, it's a good ad in that it did what it's supposed to do and got people talking. It was an imperfect ad. And so that's exactly what I spoke to them about. And they said, well, what do you think was missing? I said two things were missing. Number one was the context behind why we're having the conversation, right? That's why it came across as a little heavy-handed. Men was just like, where is this coming from? And then two, as men, what you got to think about our psychology, how we think about things, is not enough to just say you've been behaving badly and that's it. It's just like, okay, so tell me what to do now. So that was missing also. And they agreed to a certain extent. So I want to be able to affect that, right? So that when they put out the next ad, that it's a little bit more comprehensive and complete, and that it hits a little bit closer to home. But then I want to also reverse engineer from there and say, okay, is the back of your house in order, right? Is if you are putting this out in terms of being more responsible men, why are you still charging more for your female products than you are for your men? You know what I'm saying? So how's the back of your house in order? And are you, through your policies, are you paying women fairly? Are you being transparent about all of those things? That, to me, is the entire life cycle, if you will, of the work that I do. Is I'm going to help you here, but then let's make sure that you're good here so that everything in between is in order.
Like, are you practicing what you preach, essentially?
That's it.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I know that you do a lot of experiential work, and it's really awesome to see kind of through the conferences that you have, like men being able to come together and have that happen. So how do you reach those audiences, and like when they come to you, like what are they looking for?
That's a great question because I'm still trying to figure that out. When I have an event, it tends to be, I got really lucky when I did that conference in 2018 where it was a room full of men. We had over 250 people attend, and I was grateful for that perhaps maybe part of your question is trying to get at how I'm able to connect with the community, and that is just me modeling what I think is healthy, and fully understanding and acknowledging that I'm not perfect and that I'm on a journey alongside all of them or everyone. But yeah, it's just really, if I'm asking people to be vulnerable, then let me be vulnerable first. Let me show what that looks like, and then trust that people will not only connect on some level, but then find something that they're willing to kind of share back.
Yeah, and I want to actually just stop at that level of communication and marketing a little bit, because I think a lot of that has a lot of what we're dealing with when we talk about the performance of masculinity and being able to have those conversations with men and masculine presenting people is the messaging. Like, not a lot of people want to talk about vulnerability because we're still kind of like at this place where we consider vulnerability to be weak, or we consider it to be something to kind of back away from so that we can't be bare, right? And so, I'm just kind of curious in like what some of that work actually looks like when you're, in a conference and you're opening up the space. Like, is it you actually calling on people to be vulnerable, or is it a situation where you kind of find what does that look like exactly?
I don't know. Because there's no vulnerability easy button that you buy at Staples, right? Like that you just press, and then all of a sudden,
Okay.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
I think that's a God thing, to be able to create spaces like that people feel comfortable. I'll give you an example. The first thing that happened at the top of the conference that we did was we had a gentleman, Malik Yoba kind of keynoted it, and he pulled one of
shout out to New York Undercover, one of my favorite shows.
Yeah, shout out to Malik. He pulls somebody up to the front of the room as he's giving his keynote, and this gentleman's name is Fred. He's actually, turns out he's a classmate of mine from college. So he asks him a series of questions, and Fred, as he's answering them and kind of sharing his experience, breaks down and crying. And this is 5-10 minutes into the start of this conference. That set the tone for the rest of the day. You can't have a guy break down sharing his emotions in front of 250 people and that not carry through. So I don't know what the answer to that, but that happened. And so those moments are really what for me, what demark, or what I guess mark a successful event is, how vulnerable was the space where people comfortable with themselves, with the audience, and with each other to share with each other. So,
so for however long we've been doing this, what is it, like 3 years now? I don't know, 2 years, whatever.
Wow.
Like, we've been talking about this performance of masculinity. I hope that our audience can kind of understand what we're talking about when we talk about the performance of masculinity and how it's something that's learned and conditioning and the way that we perform it, even though it may not be like our natural innate self, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever. But just to keep going with this, can you kind of like speak to what the workplace performance of masculinity looks like? And it's kind of what we've been talking about, and we're trying to get the heart at, and if you could kind of go into more depth about that.
Yeah. Well, what are we at work? We're all chasing after the same things, which is success, accomplishment, accolades, the raise, the bag, etc. And specifically men, when we're kind of when we find ourselves in these environments. First of all, these environments are already innately patriarchal, so they're set up for us to compete, to strive, to excel, like all of these attributes that you would consider or you would attribute to manliness. As men, when we're in these environments and we're performing this masculinity inside these environments, we tend to. Let me take a step back, because I can only speak to my perspective, and that is Black men, Black and Latinx men. What we're going after is something that's a little bit. Well, first of all, I'll just be frank. It hasn't been created for us, right? This idea of success was not created for us inside of corporate settings. So what are we striving for as men, and what are we performing? We're performing this idea of success, or trying to achieve success that isn't innately for us. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So when I'm talking to men who are wanting to get to the C-suite, oftentimes I don't ask them how they're trying to get there. I'm asking them what they're sacrificing to get there. Like, what are you willing to give up? Are you willing to give up a sense of yourself, your identity? And I think that's what is really at stake when we find ourselves in corporate settings as men, particularly men of color, trying to perform to this notion of masculinity that wasn't ours to begin with.
Okay, but then, so you're talking about patriarchy and the workplace. Well, then how do individuals who aren't even masculine identifying adapt into that, and how is that adaptation almost negative for everyone involved?
Yeah, well, because the notion is that it's a zero-sum game, and so that I have to, as a man, with my competitive nature, I have to stomp on everybody's neck to win, because there's only one C-suite seat. There's only one promotion or a certain number of promotions per year. So, that's a very masculine, aggressive notion or mindset. So that's how it shows up. And so when we talk about allyship, we're talking about the dismantling of that mentality and that approach to make room, sometimes physical room, for an underrepresented person, right? Whether it's a woman, whether it's an LGBTQ plus member, person of color, whoever, it's oftentimes is allyship, and the way we're talking about it is to make room and to dismantle that very thing that we just talked about, which is, this idea that it's a zero-sum game, and therefore it is a very masculine thought process, if you will, behavior sets.
Okay, so I think you said the word earlier, and I think it's a word like there's this very strict binary that's very frustrating that we're all trying to wrestle with. But I think you said soften earlier, but then a lot of this stuff has to do with like being strong, and so strong is catapulted to the top is valuable, while soft, weak is at the bottom of the binary, which is negative, right? So how do we not use that lens anymore?
That's a great question. I think it mentioned it. It's focusing on humanness, focusing on each individual's kind of innate worth. I think that's hard for me to answer, because I am at this time of recording this, wrestling with examining how men can actually compete with women, for example, and still be allies, and not win or not compete at the expense of, but compete alongside of. Does that make sense? And so
go further.
So when we talk about men kind of being in positions of power traditionally, we know that women are still, it's no coincidence that today's International Latina Pay Day. So we know that women are paid less. We know that people of color are marginalized. We know that LGBTQ folks are marginalized. So in that environment, there's a clear winner, right? And it usually tends to be white, cisgender, straight men. So what I'm trying to examine is, how do we create an environment where we kind of set the playing field somewhat more equal and allow everybody to compete with one another not at the expense of another group. Does that make sense? So how can a white man compete with a black man on equal footing without one group feeling like they're being taken away from?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, because I think I want to zoom out on that a little bit, because one of the things that we've been talking about a lot here in this module is masculinity context culture. This notion that, there are like 4 different pillars that everybody's subscribing to. Women, men, everybody in between and outside of that. And so I think that one of the things that you're pointing out is like just kind of reaching through to people's humanness, and the fact of like making space for people who don't necessarily fit what that has traditionally looked like, to have those 4 pillars of like show no weakness, be ruthless at all costs, and all of those things, and how that makes space actually for a new kind of thinking. One of the things that becomes interesting is looking at the fact that everybody's really performing it, right? Like when we're talking about men and women competing alongside each other, we're not necessarily talking about the fact that, women for whom space is being made are operating outside of that kind of masculinity contest culture. And so I think that in terms of being able to tap through to people's humanness in their ability and their value as somebody who's able to perform for a company, for whatever the goal is, there's also this notion of like work culture and the goals of work being actually like contributing to like a collective. And there's also this notion of just redefining what leadership is, redefining what goals are, redefining what that is, not at the for, like as the objective of the company, and having people's well-being being part of the success of the company. Yeah. And I feel like that is something that has to do with kind of the competition culture, I think, is what I'm calling out here, which I'm not really sure if there's a way to do that in corporate environments.
Yeah,
but
well, I think there is a way, and whether it's realistic or not, I think it's really, what does the company incentivize? right? Does the company incentivize this competition, or does it incentivize collaboration? Does it incentivize, a sense of, even in how companies word job descriptions, that's a very subtle way that these messages are sent as well. So I do think I'm going to be the eternal optimist, right? Like there is a way for us to examine these things, but it has to take a fundamental shift in just, I don't want to get into a conversation about dismantling capitalism, but
let's get into it. It's all about work.
But that's really it. It's just,
Yeah.
are companies willing to, for the sake of, if they really want to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity, are they willing to shift at the most fundamental level their culture and how they're going to build a business from the beginning, right, and from scratch? And so I think that's probably the way to address it. Because right now what we're seeing is just companies trying to put Band-Aids on things, and then they try to fix a leaky faucet here, but then another one breaks, and it's just like it's a mess.
Well, actually, yeah. Can we stop there for a second? Because when we want to go next is actually, your work in diversity and inclusion. Like, what do companies come to you for? Like, what it is. So you're saying Band-Aids,
Yep.
And so I'm wondering, what does that look like? Like, what are they looking for?
Yeah. Well, my conversation, at least on its surface, wouldn't speak to diversity and inclusion work.
Okay.
But it actually does, right? We just talked about how men perform masculinity and how we've kind of been at the top of the food chain. My work around masculinity is just a Trojan horse, if you will. I come into an organization and I say, yeah, let's have a conversation about healthy manhood, but then there are tree branches off of that: allyship, diversity, inclusion, making room, making space. So that's how I penetrate those conversations. Another way is to talk about fullness of the human, right? Fullness of, or wellness, as it were. So if you show up your fullest authentic self because you are mentally, physically, and spiritually in tune and healthy, for lack of a better term, then that's inherently diverse, isn't it? And so that's good for the company, right? Because you're going to show up much more willing to be there with good attitude, much more productive. So all of those things are direct and sometimes indirect effects of, or byproducts of, diverse culture and inclusive culture. So that's why I think my work is important, in that it's another way to engage communities internally to have difficult conversations.
And so when companies come to you, there's one thing I always want to know is like, I feel like there are some companies who have people at the helm who are like, no, like we really want to be, part of this movement where we are including more people and we want to bring in more voices and like diversify. But then there's also this conversation of just like the bottom line and understanding that more diverse groups just create more revenue. And that's like been something that's been shown and that's actually been proven. So I'm just wondering, in your work, do you feel like is it a combination of both? Is it more people just really trying to impact the bottom line? Is it people just trying to, be responsible?
I think it's, so I agree that, yes, there have been studies that have shown more diverse companies actually perform better. But here's where I think companies I'm not going to give companies that much credit, because that conversation is old. Like, yes, we know that, but now it's less about putting a bunch of people in a room and saying, yes, we're diverse, go make magic. To me, the real role companies have, at least today, because the world is changing, is what are you doing to unlock that magic, right? So it's not just enough putting them in the room, but how are you there's intersectional value when it comes to putting people in the room. There's diasporic value. There's all sorts of things. I think it's up to the company to create systems and frameworks and policies that's going to help unlock that, not just put them in a room and, like you said, check the box just because the reports say that it's good for business. So that's what I'd like to see companies do more of.
So one thing that I do have a good question about, I'm really curious about, like, so you have this work, and then how do you measure it?
It's a great question. So my case study right now is the work that I did with Oath, formerly Oath, now Verizon Media Group. And it's hard. I don't have any hard data to show that it was impactful. I only have anecdotal evidence that it was good. Yeah. That it worked and that it was impactful because of once I left that, once the engagement ended, kind of the things that they did after that, right? I definitely do think that my work was influential in helping inform some of those products that they or programs that they put in place.
So, and I think that's kind of part of the issue that we're dealing with, right? Is this notion of just like measurement, or of like thinking, like dealing with things with a kind of like with a hard kind of binary line, and how, you know, capitalism really informs that thinking, and how that's kind of just the culture that in general we're trying to impact.
Why should I have to quote unquote measure it? You know, measure impact. And, you know, it's funny.
Or in that way, in numbers.
That way, right, in that way. There's, you know, I don't know if you all have read this, but there's an article by Men's Health called The Man Economy. And you should look it up. And what it talks about is really just the industry that's forming around this new conversation of around modern masculinity. And I read that and I was like, incredible. Like, even this is now an industry. It's like dollars at stake here. And it's incredible, right? But I'm like, okay, well, if that's the case, then why shouldn't I participate in that, right? Like, you know, white men are doing it. Why not me? And so that's another conversation. But I think to the point that the question that you asked, and it's really hard because as this space, this industry, for lack of a better term, is taking form, I'm also trying to figure it out as well, right? So this isn't like me coming into the tech industry that's been established. Like, the industry's forming as these businesses are coming up. And so it's really hard to figure out what that's going to look like. For me, I'm just letting my purpose be the North Star right now. And the way I'm measuring it, now that I thought about it a little bit as we're talking, is just how engaged people are. Are people really wanting to engage in these conversations? Are they sharing my stuff? Or is my followership growing? And the answer to all of that is yes. So for me, I must be doing something right. That may not be as clean as a report that I can submit to somebody, but that's okay. I think for me, that suffices right now.
Awesome. Well, listen, guys, we'll be posting all of Jason's many endeavors on our podcast. But Jason, we just want to thank you for doing the work. Thank you for putting yourself out there in various fronts to make this happen and like to really further that conversation.
No, this is humbling to me. Like I said at the top, this is just my own healing process, but I'm just choosing to be public with it, and hoping that other people can draw inspiration from it. So thank you all for giving me a platform to do it.
And Jason's wearing this badass like knit duster right now. You can't see it right now. I'm really fucking pissed that I'm not wearing it. It's dope as fuck. Shout out to you.
I know, with the pin. I was like, shout out to the pin.
It's a brooch, bro. It's a brooch.
I'm so sorry. It's a Polish.
Man, that should be my look right now.
So sorry.
I appreciate that, man.
All right, guys. So thank you guys so much for listening. As I say, we'll be posting all of Jason's info online. You can find us at Masculinity Pod on all your social medias, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And thank you guys for listening. You know, let us know how you feel.
Yeah, you got Spotify out there. Listen to
Oh my God, we have Spotify now.
Right, boom.
Yeah.
I was just at Spotify too. It's funny.
Oh, dope.
Yeah.
Face the rolling.
I know. It's out here. All right, guys. Thank you guys so much for listening. This is Samantha and Zessie.
It's your boy, Ramoy George Philip D. First.
And this has been Masculinity.
Peace.
Ciao.